I've got a 2011, it's pretty much the same for now. From 1999 through to 2011 when the slide was initially put together, there had been 13 outdoor experiments approved. 2 were withdrawn, 2 had serious breaches, and the third one with breaches as well. 6 closed down with no viable outcomes. Ruakura at Hamilton, that's where the ag research of the animals. Rotorua, Scion, otherwise known as Forest Research Institute, with the GE trees. Lincoln, which was crop and food, then plant and food. Whakamaru was the sheep up in the Waikato, and that was a private company, PPL. At the moment we have 2 field trials. New Zealand's in a pretty good shape in terms of live genetically engineered organisms. We could nail it really quickly if we finish with the trees. There's a slight complication I'll talk about after with those, but the GE trees at one site, and there's the GE animals at Ruakura. So 2 sites only that have genetically engineered organisms legally allowed in New Zealand. The ag research one is goats, cows and sheep. They're only doing, as far as I'm aware at the moment, just the cattle and the goats. The sheep, well, they've got permission, they haven't done it as yet. They also have, they're allowed to use all sorts of other different animals, cells into these animals to do what they want to do. Scion, the trees got knocked around, and I'll show you some of the couple of slides from that era. But they got another approval through a couple of years back that basically allowed the equivalent of 4,000 trees over a 20-year period. So they do them in batches, and they only can go for 8 years in total, or when they have reproductive things like cones or pollen on them, then they have to come out. It's up at the Redwood Park. If you look up to Rotorua and know where the big redwoods are, very easy to find and go and have a look at, and ask me any time and I'll give you very clear directions to it. Arborgen nursery at Te Teko, further through the sort of Waikato, Bay of Plenty area. Arborgen works in North Scion, and I'll just talk about that in a moment. So GE field trial around ryegrass, we anticipate an application, but all this pushback means that Wrightsons and others that are fiddling around with that are doing their field trials overseas at this point. They tend to have international partners. Scion is with Arborgen, as I say, the Horizon 2 and Rubicon, that's the New Zealand component. Rubicon came out of Fletcher Forest, so most us older ones all knew Fletcher Forest. We were proud of it, the New Zealand company and all of that. It devolved into different parts. Horizon 2 was a laboratory where they do the genetics work and the likes, and not all of it's GE, of course. And then there was Rubicon, which was a range of different issues around timber and nursery type work. That is Rubicon is the Horizon 2 got lost into Rubicon, I think, at that point when they became part of Arborgen with 2 major American partners. So ultimately there's 3 different organisations lost themselves into this giant called Arborgen, and Horizon 2, the lab work and all that intellectual property went into Arborgen as well. Rubicon, the New Zealand component, is actually 80% plus US owned or overseas owned. It's not even a New Zealand company really. There's a lot of mum and dad investors have a few shares, but they don't amount to very much. It's effectively a US company, the whole thing. And that's who Scion is linked in with for these trees. And they're sneaky and they're lying. And we're not allowed to say the word lying in Parliament, but they do lie to meet their ends, and they can talk about the lies. After plant and food, they went with Seminis, part of Monsanto. PGG Wrightson, they sort of work in with ag research and planting food variously, but also independently. They are now, of course, Chinese owned principally, 51% owned by Agria. There's a tiny little bit of Ngāi money in there as well, but New Hope and ANZ Bank I see there. That is an overseas company well and truly. In fact, overseas companies, I think 25% or more overseas shares, and they're described as overseas, but these guys are over 51%, and they're the ones pushing for ryegrass. It's not in our open environment, but they are a dominant player in New Zealand. Ag Research, a couple of pharmaceutical type outfits, Genzyme, Transgenic Corporation, they've sold off some of their stuff to some of the French, but they are the ones that are trying to make animals into pharmaceutical factories instead of doing it on a lab bench. Well, they can. The things they're doing, they can do in a vat with bacteria in a lab or in a factory, but they want to do it with the animals. Whakamaru is PPL. You might have heard of Dolly the sheep. That was known years ago from clone, and it was all sorts of wonderful until it got arthritic and respiratory issues and passed away. It sort of aged very quickly because it seems that the cloning sort of took the age with it. So that it was a young animal as it grew up, the aging process was further involved in it. I'm not the scientist on that, but it was something like that. So that was a very big operation up at Whakamaru, and I'll show you a couple of photos of that later. Claire and I have had a good nose around there as well. We don't see fences very easily or gates, but it was empty at the time as well after the event. I think something like 3,000 or even more sheep had to get killed when they went bust because it wasn't working. A lot of the sheep had arthritic problems and that. They weren't all dollies, but they were of that ilk. That company went broke over in Scotland, I think it was, and then broke here, and those sheep had to be culled and then they were burnt, and I'll show you the ash pile after. Oh, not the ash, where it went. Okay, this is Scion. Pinus radiata. These little trees here, that was early planting. They look pretty sparse and straggly. Were very vulnerable to being cut down for those that burrowed under the fence. There were some other trees as well. This here is a pruning of some nearby trees. They were the conditions of approval from URMA at the time, Environmental Risk Management Authority, said all material that wasn't growing as such had to be taken away, autoclaved or burnt, incinerated. What I found when I was sort of looking there repeatedly, every time I go out near Rotorua I'd go and have a look, and then one time I spent 2 days and just kept going back to really appraising it, and I found that they were mowing in there and just driving out with a mower, open the compound and off they'd go. No clean down at all, no facility for clean down. They just didn't care because they say it wasn't heritable material, it wasn't going to grow, but they were taking out material in their mower and it was breaking the consent conditions. So even if it was silly, they were breaking it. So those little ones there, they do fluff up to something like that. So the ones in the foreground, not the ones in the back, it was a windbreak. Ones in the foreground were the trees, the bigger ones next to those little ones. They were meant to prune those at 2.5 metres, and those are about 4.5 metres there high. 2.5 metres they were to prune them and leave a central leader. So it's the central, but it's a strange thing, I don't know how you do that with a pine tree really anyway, but that was a condition because, 2.5 metres here, you can see if there's any cones, you can see if there's any pollen features, but at 4.5 metres you need a ladder and clearly you start to lose the ability to be real good about it. They were just freshly pruned. See all the prunings in that little compound? That came after our complaint. We said, hey, you're just mowing over the prunings, not meant to be doing that. So they changed, they got the authority, allowed them to then compost or to do something there. They made this special little compound within the compound, this big multi-wire electric and wire, sharp wire and all of that. That rubbishy thing there to the right was the little nursery area. It was previously, it was all long grass and everything. It was just, they'd had seedlings and pots there that clearly dried out, that had, in their own report, showed that they produced pollen cones. Theoretically, they were removed to the lab, but that was, we get that out of the OIAs in their own reports. They were shonky. They don't give a hoot because they don't think there's a problem. They don't care. But some of them were taller than their other height, which was, even if you did your 2.5 metre central lead, you still had to nail it. I think it was 4.5 or 5 metres. There's a couple that were taller, and I produced that evidence to them.